Just, I guess for C-38, you brought forward amendments, and it held up that budget process, but it sure didn't stop it. So how many amendments are you proposing, which will be at report stage, I gather?
Yeah.
And what do you think can be accomplished with this?
Well, I brought forward the amendments in C-38 in the same spirit in which I bring forward these amendments, not to obstruct, but in hopes that the government might relent and accept some of my amendments so that the bill would be improved. I spoke with people in the Federation of Canadian Municipalities whose support for this bill has been used as an excuse for destroying the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and it's clear that they would have liked some relief, for instance, on some projects that required more review than they felt was necessary, but they weren't lobbying for the destruction of navigable waters protection across Canada. So my goal is, and to answer your question, how many? Approximately 80 amendments will be submitted. We've worked them up to improve this legislation, to ensure that there is actually an objective standard, and that we remove the schedule. So we'd be moving towards a way in which the government's ends, which they claim is to make sure that the Navigable Waters Protection Act doesn't become unnecessarily burdensome to projects. We're taking that into account and bringing forward amendments that I hope will actually engage Conservatives. It could happen. It hasn't happened yet, but that doesn't mean it might never happen, in reconsidering. And with the kind of public concern about this bill, which I can tell you right now is growing, I hope that the amendments will be carried, and then the bill won't destroy the Navigable Waters Protection Act.
Just ask you what would be next. You were talking about the provinces can't protect waterways. Right. This is the federal government's role. If this doesn't succeed, which who knows, would you consider a court challenge? Absolutely,
and I'm sure I should see if any of the other groups are considering it. I mean, the difficulty is that I can't find any other example in the history of this country where the federal government has withdrawn from a constitutional head of power which it is assigned under the Constitution. So the irony here is that Conservative MP after Conservative MP and minister stands up in the House and says, this law was never intended to protect navigable waters. Well, I can tell you that when the Constitution of Canada, then the British North America Act, was drafted, the criminal law head of power never anticipated cybercrime. Right? We didn't, constitutional heads of power and constitutional law principles require that as society evolves, the law and that head of power evolves with it. So this is, I think, part and parcel of what I see Stephen Harper doing, which is dismantling federal responsibilities for the environment right across the board. Protection of fisheries is a federal head of power under the Constitution. Protection of navigation is a federal head of power under the Constitution. And the steps that are being taken dismantle a role which is the federal government's role exclusively. They then say, well, don't worry, because navigation will be protected as a matter of common law. Now, what that means is that if somebody's favorite stream or river is being obstructed, it could be a big project, it could be a neighbor who decides to build a bridge without a permit. But if that waterway is being obstructed under our current law, the person who's obstructing it is breaking the law. And it's very, very straightforward to get the Navigable Waters Protection Act engaged on those issues. Under the C-45, the way it's drafted, the person would have the right to go to court, hire a lawyer, and pursue it as a matter of common law. That's an outrageous distortion of the Canadian, as Sarah said, this goes back through our history and our culture. This goes back to our earliest days, and it's not an anachronism. I know a lot of people who value that their land is on a stream or a river that leads to a larger body of water, and the quality of life for that particular property is heightened by the fact that they can put their canoe or their kayak in the water near where they live and paddle out to a larger body of water. Or that you can go by train into the remote parts of Canada. Bruce Heyer, who didn't introduce himself, Bruce Heyer, Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Superior North, happens to have a wilderness resort that he owns, where people can take the train to the middle of Armstrong's the best train stop, isn't it? And get off with a canoe and put it in the water. I mean, this is part of our way of life, and Stephen Harper doesn't seem to understand that navigation and navigable waters really matter to Canadians, and that to say they no longer exist because they've got a list that includes 62 rivers and 97 lakes is so appalling. I don't think any Canadian would have ever imagined, even the people who voted Conservative, would have never imagined that they would propose to eliminate the navigation protections over 99.5% of the waterways in Canada. Oh, sorry. I'm feeling very guilty here. Please, someone stop me if you want to add something.
I wouldn't mind just stepping in on that piece about the court case, because this is really important, and water keepers exist to defend our waterways. And, you know, we're willing, but this piece of the changes to the Navigation Water Protection Act are really important, that we're going from a proactive piece of legislation where before the project is built, public has an ability to consult and improve the project. It goes through parliamentary review. Well, that has changed now. So if these changes go through, no public consultation, you won't even be aware that the project is built. So now it becomes reactive. Your only chance to change things on 99% of our water bodies are to take a court case on. And that's going to be up to you and I to foot the bill, to challenge these projects in court after they're already built. So now it becomes very reactive.
By water, or a whole court case?
Water, project by project, water body by water body. So it's going to become very cumbersome, it's expensive, it's not going to be easy, and Transport Canada has said it right up front. They said, well, now we're going to leave it to the citizens. All you need is a couple of precedent-setting court cases. They say, well, it's easier said than done, but now the onus has gone from the federal government to protect your navigational rights to you and I to protect our own navigational rights, and that's not right.
Could I just ask a question of Sarah Harmer, please? What do you think your presence in this issue and the presence of other musicians in Canada actually says to people? What role or what weight does your presence add to this campaign?
I feel like I'm here representing the common citizen who cares about this country, and with the privilege of being able to have traveled it so many times and to have met so many different communities and to have seen so many different water systems. I also think that culturally our land and our water has been a huge source of inspiration for our sense of who we are as a people. And so that's why I'm here. I'm mostly here because I'm concerned as a citizen, and I think if there was enough room, I don't know if there'd be nearly enough room in this whole building to house all of the people in the country that are equally concerned. So I'm here to help represent those people.
Just another question. How do you think Canadians relate to the water? I mean, do you think they mostly relate to water through recreation, or?
It really depends where you live and what your income bracket is. I mean, so many people rely on the water because they rely on the food that comes out of the water. They rely on the fish. They rely on the tourism. They rely on... and also, I mean, we are water. Water isn't something that we can isolate from ourselves. We entirely rely upon water. It's crucial. It's the most crucial thing to be concerned about.
Just a follow-up question just while you're there. Are you hopeful that maybe your name and along with Feist and Gord Downie, that will kind of bring a bit of star power or a bit of jazz to an issue that, not to say that people don't care about it, but it's definitely not something that everyone is talking about at their supper table, the Navigable Waters Act. Sure. It's something that's difficult to even wrap your tongue around. So do you think that maybe that will help out with the awareness piece?
I hope so. And I know that people like Feist and Gord Downie have been working on issues that revolve around water for years, along with a number of citizens' coalitions. And so it's not new, the concern with water, and this particular need to be informed about projects, whether they be a pipe that's being put into a river system that's going to knock out your outboard motor and, you know, put yourself in peril, to a larger hydro construction. I mean, we need to be informed as citizens, and yeah, I hope that musicians and cultural people will help bring attention to that.
Just for Elizabeth May, I guess, following up on that same sentiment, I guess, how do you take an issue like this and get to get average Canadians to care about it and to understand exactly what this means?
Well, I think we're suffering through something akin to what Naomi Klein described in Shock Doctrine. C-38 just blew apart so many environmental laws, the Environmental Assessment Act being repealed, the Fisheries Act habitat protections being gone, the changes that the threats to charities and so on, so that when C-45 just a few months later comes along, another 440-some page piece of legislation, the reaction, the average Canadian, I mean, at this point we haven't even been able to get traction in the media to explain that Navigable Waters Protection Act is being destroyed and what that means. And when the minister can stand up and say, oh, well, this law only protects, this was meant to protect navigation, not navigable waters, it's really obfuscating something that if Canadians, could begin to understand how much is being destroyed, those who understand, I think, feel overwhelmed in that sense of shock doctrine. Those who haven't heard about it yet will be angry when they hear about it. And I'm very grateful to Gord Downie and Feist and, of course, Sarah Harmer for being here today, because it is important to reach people who, C-45, another omnibus bill, well, people may be, and I think a lot of Canadians are upset about the loss of democracy inherent in lumping so many bills together and pretending it's about a budget when it's about destroying our environmental laws. But the specifics of it have been very hard to get across. I mean, some of you will remember that the minute I read C-45, I did a scrum and said in C-38, Stephen Harper took an axe to the environmental laws passed by Brian Mulroney. And in C-45, he's going after the ones passed by Sir John A. Macdonald. I mean, it's it's just absolutely outrageous. But it hasn't translated into enough awareness in terms of, as you say, it's not being discussed around supper tables. Well, it's being discussed in the environmental movement and certainly recreational organizations, groups like Waterkeeper, groups like Mark Madsen, and other organizations across Canada are concerned. I think this press conference and the engagement of some of our cultural icons will help people discover across Canada that they don't like the sounds of this. We've had an amazing response to something we put on our website, which is the Green Party website, which was, see if your favorite lake or river is on this, right? So that drew people in to say, well, this heritage river, that major river, they're not there. How could they not be there? So there is definitely a growing movement of concern about this, but we want to take it up a few notches before we take the amendments forward in hopes that people will contact their members of Parliament and ask for them to speak up for waters within the Conservative caucus, and perhaps some of my amendments could pass. That would be the best possible outcome.
That the average person could wake up to the danger of this bill as you see it.
I guess they'd have to see it on the CBC National News.
Navigable waters, as we were saying, is very obscure. What should the average person sitting there, what could happen to them?
Well, the reality is that depending on what province or territory you're in, there could be laws that deal with certain aspects of blocking navigable waters. But the ability to say you have a right to canoe, to kayak, to raft down remote waterways and wilderness across Canada, for fishing, for recreation, for those rights of navigation are only protected by the federal government. And more than that, can only be protected by the federal government because it's an exclusive head of power under the Constitution. So back to court challenges. I'd like to investigate whether there's a court challenge when the federal government voluntarily withdraws from a head of power that no other level of government can take up. So there'll be some pieces of laws, if it's a giant hydro project in Ontario, chances are the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act will catch it. But that's just also a guess. Chances are, maybe not, maybe. If you're going to be destroying a waterway for the oil sands projects, and right now the Muskeg River is scheduled for substantial destruction in the course of expansion of an oil sands project, and it's not listed. So that's another reason that these laws are being blown apart. It's that the increase in resource extraction in mining, oil sands, potentially large-scale hydro. The Navigable Waters Protection Act has at least required that there be advance notice and an opportunity for the public to be consulted, and for the Minister of Transport to decide if this is an appropriate project based on an environmental review. So the way in which we're seeing the dismantling, now we're losing the Minister of Transport even making a decision. As things stand right now, the Environmental Assessment Act is so weak. If you got a federal environmental review, it would, at its absolutely narrowest under C-38, the new so-called SEA 2012, would allow an environmental review to look at the impact on migratory birds, fish, and certain aquatic plants, and that's all. So we're dealing with, it's hard to put into words how devastating this is. The entire framework of environmental laws is being systematically destroyed in Canada. This is a very critical piece that's being destroyed. And John, I can tell you want to add something. I just heard a sigh there.
Well, there's 2 points to be made. The 2 examples Elizabeth just referred to, where the province may be responsible now, a hydro project in Ontario. Ontario Power Generation is owned by the province of Ontario. So if there's a major hydro project in Ontario, the proponent of the project is the province. And the federal government just said, well, the proponent of the project can also be the adjudicator and the judge and the jury of whether or not it's a good project and it's being done properly. We've always had a system in which those who are disinterested in the outcome should be the ones that make the decisions. The second point is by taking away protections of water, we're opening the way for privatizing water in Canada. That those rivers that aren't protected, there'll be no defenses now to those governments that want to privatize them, export our water, or sell us our own water in the future. Canadians should be concerned about something that's now a public property, where the water is, that when we pay for water, we only pay for the processing of it. We don't actually pay for the water. In the future, this government's clearing the way for the federal government to stand aside while our water resources are privatized. And that's why Canadians should be concerned, because it's going to hit them in the pocketbook in a few years. It's going to mean their children aren't going to get to do the same kinds of recreational activities at the same kinds of costs that we see now. That's what's being taken away, and it's being pretended that this is somehow an efficiency. It's a big lie. They're out to steal our resources and give them to other people. That's why Canadians should be concerned.
I want to make sure that I'll clarify that the amendments will be going forward, I think, as early as Wednesday they can be tabled. I also want to thank the Liberal Party for a very spirited effort in the Parliamentary Committee on Bill C-45. I haven't had an opportunity, to thank them publicly. I think any effort from opposition parties to say to Stephen Harper that an agenda this egregious can't just be shoved down our throats. There's other parts of C-45 I find objectionable. Clearly the destruction of the Navigable Waters Protection Act is the worst part of the bill in terms of the environment.
You delayed the bill with your amendments.
Oh, it's not a question of delay, but assuming that each amendment is accepted and each one is voted on separately, so whatever 80 amendments times 5 minutes comes down to, certainly there'll be some other amendments from the other parties. Yeah, we're possibly going to have another 24-hour voting round. But the point is not delay. The point is to say we want these amendments. We're prepared to compromise. Let's talk about how to fix the Navigable Waters Protection Act. I'm glad we got back to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. I am sorry. I knew this would happen because...
But we'll be here forever.
Well, I'm happy to explain the amendments. Yeah, we're working on the way the bill works is that there are repeated references to the schedule, and so if we can eliminate the references to the schedule, it will revert that everything is navigable again. So that's the key piece. But there's other pieces that we're bringing in too. We want a parliamentary review of ministerial orders so that we can have some oversight of when projects are designated as minor works or minor waters. There's a lot of specifics around. Right now, they've exempted bridges, booms, dams, and causeways, and saying they're all minor works. So we are doing some work with the nitty-gritty of the bill that would address what Mr. Harper says they want to do, which is stop the Navigable Waters Protection Act from unnecessarily being burdensome to municipalities. Again, query why the vast majority of waters that aren't listed are the ones that are, thousands of kilometers from a municipality, right? So no cottages in sight. And the cottage country, which as someone has pointed out, the conservative riding cottage country is still protected by the Navigable Waters Protection Act. Any other last? Thank you all for coming. Merci beaucoup.